Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're taking a truly fascinating journey today, bridging ancient biblical theology with, believe it or not, modern artificial intelligence and network state theory. I know, it sounds like a totally wild combination, right? But the sources we're looking at draw a stunningly clear line between the ancient texts that literally shaped human morality and the cutting-edge digital architectures of tomorrow. We're going to explore how we define who we are, how power is actually justified, and how we might use technology to architect a much more mature society. So, to frame the high philosophical stakes of today's exploration, we need to start with a really profound question. Can a sacred identity just be inherited? Simply by being born in a certain place? Or is it something that absolutely must be earned through struggle? As we decode our source material today, keep this question right in the back of your mind. It is literally the central tension driving everything we're about to discuss.
Here's a quick roadmap for our explainer. We're going to cover the weight of a name, merit versus blood right, the tragedy of unearned power, architecting the divine script, and finally, the Jacobsland one commandment.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the weight of a name, looking at Agadah and Halakha. Before we can really talk about nation-states or digital societies, we have to establish the baseline theology of how laws and stories weave together to give names their deep moral weight. Historically, Jewish law maintained this incredible staying power over millennia, and it wasn't because it was backed by the heavy military might of an empire, like Roman law was, but through voluntary acceptance by a global community. So how did they pull that off? Well, by deeply integrating two specific elements, Agadah and Halakha. Agadah represents the rich narrative stories. It gives us the moral why. Halakha, on the other hand, is the technical, everyday lived law. It provides the structured how. The sources argue that true law has to be a lived, voluntary path that combines both the story and the structure, rather than just being some set of state-enforced mandates.
Moving right along to Section 2, let's talk about merit versus blood right.
Now that we understand how deeply embedded meaning and lived law create an identity, let's explore how that identity is actually acquired. Historically, we see a clash of two massive concepts. On one side, there's geographic blood right. This is basically the modern Westphalian norm of claiming territory and sovereignty essentially by default. It's the idea of utai posititas, meaning as you possess, where simply holding physical ground gives you authority. On the flip side, we have spiritual merit. In ancient theological frameworks, a sacred identity couldn't just be handed down based on where you happened to be born. It required profound, intense personal struggle. It literally had to be earned.
This brings us to a really powerful example from the texts. Think about the biblical story of Jacob, wrestling with an angel, or God, through the night. He doesn't just inherit his ultimate title, right? He fights for it. He struggles physically and spiritually. And only after all of that is he given the sacred name Israel. The theological framework we're examining posits that this ancient wrestling match is undeniable proof that the name was not simply a geographic inheritance. It was a sacred mantle, a title earned through an intense, transformative struggle.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, the tragedy of unearned power.
So, what exactly happens when a sacred identity is claimed without doing the work? What happens when you just skip the spiritual wrestling match altogether? Well, the sources present a very specific theological critique here. They define desecration in this context as claiming a sacred identity purely by geographic blood right and using it to wield state power, completely without demonstrating the necessary spiritual merit. Now, it's really important to note that our explainer isn't taking any political sides here. We're just neutrally reporting on this absolutely fascinating theological argument. And the argument states that taking a sacred biblical identity merely as a tool for wielding territorial power is a fundamental desecration of the Bible's deepest wisdom.
According to the source material, wielding unearned power inevitably results in tragedy. They use a pretty stark metaphor for this. It makes an entity act like a child given a gun. Just think about that. Just as a child completely lacks the maturity, the restraint, and the deep understanding required to handle a weapon safely, an immature political force that wields sacred, unearned power inevitably leads to disaster and bloodshed. They have the how of state power, sure, but they are totally missing the why of spiritual maturity.
And when physical power is completely disconnected from spiritual maturity like that, you get a catastrophic clash. It perfectly visualizes the profound tragedy that occurs when something sacred is co-opted by the immature.
Okay, let's pivot a bit and move into Section 4, architecting the divine script.
If the core problem is immaturity and the desecration of a sacred name, how in the world do we solve it? Well,
This is where we turn to modern technology. The sources argue that we can actually address this societal immaturity using tools like artificial intelligence. But here's the catch. An AI doesn't inherently understand sacred wisdom or the tragedy of bloodshed. It's literally just code. So the sources explain that you have to assert authorship. Step 1, you step out of the passive user role. Step 2, you become what they call the algorithmic orchestrator. And step 3, you actively force the machine to adopt your specific theological framework. You inject your own spiritual vocabulary right into the digital outputs. You're literally architecting the theology into the AI script.
To really wrap our heads around this, think about history in terms of supreme forces, or leviathans, that hover over us and make humans behave in pro-social ways. Back in the 1800s, the dominant leviathan was God. People behaved because they feared divine punishment. Fast forward to the 1900s, and it was the state. You behaved because the government would punish you. But today, a new leviathan is rising, and it's the network. Cryptography, community, and code are quickly becoming the ultimate arbiters of truth and behavior. By becoming an algorithmic orchestrator, you are effectively using this new network leviathan to enforce a deeply moral framework.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the Jacobsland 1 commandment.
Let's synthesize all of this into an actionable, technological, and societal solution. Balaji Srinivasan's network state theory proposes a brilliant idea. You don't start a new society with a massive overbearing political doctrine. Instead, you unite an opt-in community around a one commandment. This is a singular, highly abstract moral premise designed to solve a specific state failure. It's about creating a highly focused, parallel startup society that makes one impactful change based entirely on a shared moral code.
So, the crucial point is how this actually applies to our earlier theological dilemma. Our sources propose wielding the AI's divine script to enforce the term Jacobsland as a one commandment. Think about what this means in practice. By using the name Jacobsland, they are temporarily replacing the sacred name of Israel. Why do that? Because Jacob was the name before the struggle, before the merit was actually earned. Calling it Jacobsland acts as a protective, transitional moniker. It fully acknowledges the current societal immaturity, the child with a gun, while actively preserving the path for them to eventually mature, undergo that necessary spiritual struggle, and one day truly earn the sacred mantle. It essentially protects the sacred from desecration while leaving the door wide open for real growth.
Which brings us right back to where we started, but hopefully with a much deeper perspective. Take a look at the power structures in your own life and in the world around us. Are the identities we claim merely inherited by geographic blood right, or have we truly done the wrestling to earn them? Have we genuinely earned the maturity to wield them? That is a pretty heavy thought to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today, and remember, always keep questioning the script.